Good day, I'm Joe Lockhart, and today I'd like to discuss Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, and censorship. Mark Twain deserves recognition for the number of times his books have been challenged or banned in roughly the last century and a quarter, ever since Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in 1885, and immediately banned by the Concord, Massachusetts Public Library. In some ways, not much has changed since 1985. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn continually ranks near the top of the American Library Association's list of most challenged books. Twain's novels continue to be challenged and banned, but new reasons for opposing them have emerged through the years. Looking back over the debates about Twain's books provides an interesting perspective on how American culture has changed, how Twain helped to change it, and why his books continue to raise difficult questions today. When Huckleberry Finn was banned in 1885, officials at the Concord Public Library thought it was, quote, rough, coarse, and inelegant, the whole book being more suited to the slums than to intelligent, respectable people, end quote. Written in the voice of its young narrator, who rejects becoming, quote, civilized on its first page, and it's full of various dialects throughout, the book offended the literary sensibilities of the time. Twain redoubled the insult to the literary establishment by insisting that his books be sold door-to-door by subscription instead of through bookstores. He appealed to the masses both in his language and by having his books brought directly to their homes. Quote, my books are water, those of the great geniuses is wine, end quote. Twain once wrote, everybody drinks water. Twain was a businessman. 20 years later, when Huckleberry Finn and the Adventures of Tom Sawyer were removed from the public library in Brooklyn, New York, their literary style was no longer in dispute. By 1905, Twain was already considered a monumental literary force, and he was at the height of his international celebrity. But the boy's actions raised problems. Library officials explained that they provided bad examples for the youth of the day. Twain still gets blamed for inciting young people to misbehave. About a decade ago, for example, when a ninth grader from Hollister, California took money from his family and flew off to Hawaii, his mother explained, Tom Sawyer is his hero, so he thought he would venture off like Tom Sawyer did. Well, in the Green Hills of Africa, Ernest Hemingway wrote that, quote, all modern literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before, there has been nothing as good since, end quote. Perhaps that statement is a bit overinflated and possibly quoted too much, but in 1935, the centennial of Twain's birth, Hemingway's tribute to Twain's tremendous influence was not even controversial, and it has been reinforced in later tributes by countless other writers who learned what literature could be from reading Huckleberry Finn. So today there's no doubt that the book banned so quickly by the Concord Public Library really did transform American literature. Although fears that Twain's books will incite youthful rebellion persist, I think somewhat fancifully, we wish that they might misbehave a bit more from reading, but that's not the primary reason they're challenged today. Since the 1950s, Twain's depiction of race relations in the pre-Civil War South has caused most objections to Huckleberry Finn. Because of the racial vocabulary Twain used repeatedly in the novel, parents and teachers are concerned about the effect that reading has on students, reading these terms. The issue of race came to the fore when the civil rights movement brought increased attention to connections between racial epithets and racial violence. Quoting Chester B. Stevens, vice president of the African American Parent Coalition in Piedmont Hills, California, that challenged the novel in 1995. Quote, "For me, each sound of the word nigger rings out like the sound of rifle fire as the bullet tears through the face of Dr. King, and like the shotgun blast tearing into the back of Medgar Evers, or the threats being yelled by racist adults as they block the paths of little black children on their way to school." End quote. Tamara Cobb explained in September of 1996, when Huckleberry Finn was challenged in Washington, D.C., quote, "It's a word that is a call to arms for African Americans," end quote. Of course, those reactions are not to the racism of the pre-Civil War South that Twain criticized in the novel, but rather to the racism that continues to permeate U.S. society. Quoting David Bradley, author of the Chaney'sville Incident, quote, "If we'd eradicated the problem of racism in our society, Huckleberry Finn would be the easiest book in the world to teach," end quote. But it hasn't been. So the novel forces readers to confront racism, both as Twain portrayed it and his language as it gets interpreted today. In a NewsHour interview some years ago with David Gergen, the noted Twain scholar Shelley Fisher Fishkin, now recently retired, and the author of Was Huck Black? Mark Twain and African American Voices, described Twain's novel as a Trojan horse in the school curriculum. Quote, "His book enters as a classic only to explode like a hand grenade with all of these combustible issues." She said in another interview that the novel, quote, "argues that it's often the polite, honorable people in a morally bankrupt society, the Aunt Sallys and Uncle Silases, who tolerate acts that are heinous," end quote. Not end quote, sorry. We're still not comfortable probing that, but if Huck Finn incites questions and arguments about these issues, that's one of the most valuable things that can happen in a classroom, end quote. She adds that Twain's novel is, quote, "often the first and only book on the school syllabus that even addresses racism," end quote. Reactions to Huckleberry Finn today are a sign of both the progress made since the book was published and the continuing racial divisions within U.S. society. Twain's book was published during what is now recognized as the historical low point in post-Civil War race relations within the United States. Reconstruction was disintegrating, racial violence, the Ku Klux Klan was escalating, and by the turn of the century, new laws establishing Jim Crow segregation and restricting African Americans' right to vote were being passed throughout the South and upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Within that context, it is not surprising that contemporary reviews of the novel did not focus on racial issues. What is surprising is that there was not more understanding and criticism of its sharply anti-racist position and of the depth of the interracial friendship between Huck and Jim that it portrayed. The often heated debate today about racism in the novel is an indication of awareness and concern about the issue in American society. And I should add that I was interviewed 3 years ago about an attempt to ban the book in Glendale, Arizona. It's still very much here an issue. But what divides most thoughtful critics and supporters of the novel is really a question of strategy. Can you end racism in the United States by shielding students from language and issues that make them uncomfortable? Or does it need to be directly confronted, with Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn being one of the books that is most widely available for that purpose. Or as I once listened to a famous African-American actor respond to this exact point by a black teacher in the audience, someone who was clearly opposed to Huckleberry Finn appearing in a classroom. He responded, quote, "Would you really believe a novel set in Missouri in the 1840s where a 12-year-old white boy did not use that word?" It's a response that reminds us of how pervasive racism has been in the United States and how it infuses every part of American history and literature. Well, in his essay, My First Lie and How I Got Out of It, Mark Twain answered such questions when he attacked the, quote, lie of silent assertion, end quote, that kept people from jumping to the abolitionist cause before the Civil War. Quote, argue and plead and pray as they might, abolitionists could not break the universal stillness that reigned from pulpit and press all the way down to the bottom of society. The clammy stillness created and maintained by the lie of silent assertion. The silent assertion that there wasn't anything going on in which humane and intelligent people were interested, end quote. Twain concluded that, quote, the silent, colossal national lie that is the support and confederate of all the tyrannies and shams and inequalities and unfairnesses that afflict the peoples, that is the one to throw bricks and sermons at, end quote. This, as I have argued in a previous talk, is the effect of self-censorship, the form of censorship that is more pervasive and effective than all official censorship. Every year in communities across the United States, when this book gets debated or challenged, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn confronts that silence. In 1885, the novel challenged a deeply entrenched, elitist literary establishment that found the book, quote, more suited to the slums than to intelligent, respectable people, end quote. Today, it challenges the lie of silent assertion that racism is no longer a pressing concern in the United States. Removing the book from school curriculums and libraries can only strengthen that lie, can only inhibit discussion of race instead of addressing the subject in a positive manner. Instead of banning Huckleberry Finn, we should count it among the weapons that can be used to confront racism in the United States.